Hey, what's up? It's Bon. I want to talk about romances in video games, and probably not how you think. So I think to start off, the reason I want to talk about this is so in the last year, I've played Baldur's Gate 3, Starfield, Mass Effect trilogy. We're not going to talk about Andromeda, and Cyberpunk 2077. And I guess it would help to clarify kind of how I experience or play romances in video games, because it seems like there's a lot of variety. For me, I feel like I am helping write the narrative for the protagonist I'm playing as and whoever the interest is. I'm not the type who's personalizing this. This isn't me romancing this character. I won't try to yuck anyone's yum. I think there can come some kind of weird just things with that. I've noticed in all of those communities, sometimes you notice there's people who have maybe gotten into these relationships a bit more than maybe was intended, but to each their own. That's not my problem. So if you look at it the way I do, as you're participating in the narrative, even writing the narrative to a point for the characters you're watching, which is how I play these games. I think all of those games offer interesting differences and similarities. So I'll start with Cyberpunk. I actually just in the last couple of days got back into it. There's a big update coming, DLC 2.0 update, supposed to change a lot of things. And I remembered that in 2022, I had played through the game finally. I buzzed through the story. I didn't romance anyone. I hardly did any side stuff. I just basically did the main quest and finished it. And I liked it. Now, obviously, it wasn't as fulfilling as it could have been. I know that when you do the side quest, when you do romances, things like that, it does change the possibilities at the end of the game. And I assume I got like the bog standard, most generic ending you can get. So when I fired up Cyberpunk again, I was finishing up the side quest to romance Pan Am. If you've followed Cyberpunk at all, you'll know that Pan Am is one of the more popular characters because, as the kids say, she's kind of a baddie. I'm sorry, but it was interesting because, and I recall how that goes, and Cyberpunk is an interesting game, and I really feel like the romance is kind of a good example of like the whole game, where it's all flash and little substance, right? Where you have some really interesting moments, including the physical scene that you get with Pan Am in the tank, which was pretty well talked about when that game came out. But it doesn't go much beyond that, right? You finish that mission, and then you may get a few calls and texts. But as far as I can tell, you can't even bring her along on missions or anything after that. She's not involved in the story until the conclusion, which I understand that exists. And it's kind of interesting, and I'll talk about those other games in a minute, but like how unsatisfying that can be, because you kind of realize that you weren't even making like a relationship for your character. You were just completing a quest line that if you picked certain choices, you could see some things basically. And not to down the voice acting and all of that of the two characters interacting, but there's not a lot there, right? Especially after you complete the fairly linear quest line. So then you talk about a game like Mass Effect, which is I'm specifically talking about the Legendary Edition, which is up to date as of 2021, but it's still the OG game from the late 2000s, early 2010s. And I would say, because of things like being able to, for the most part, have any romance, interests, typically be part of your squad, at least in 2, or depending on which game you're playing. And because there is a decent amount of time in between the progression of things, and that it's pretty rare that you'll begin a romance sequence with one of the Mass Effect characters and end it all in one quest line. It's typically you're going to have to, you do one thing and it progresses it one tick, and then you have to do other stuff, and it's a slower roll. And I feel like in some ways it makes it more satisfying like that, being a trilogy of games, even though you can't technically romance the same person in every one. There is another element of the going from one game to another and carrying on a narrative that involves a romance and stuff like that. And then it really is just the actual interactions and the writing they did for the romance scenes and the progression of romances and stuff like that in Mass Effect. There's also the factor of the number of potential romances you could have, or the number of potential partners in that game. And I believe it's definitely the most of all of the 4 games I'm talking about. And the trilogy Mass Effect still, it's old, right? And there's lots and lots of things that make it feel old, and there's lots of parts of it that you can tell the age of the game. But even as I as a spoiler to what I'm getting at, I still don't think any of the newer games have done it that much better. Now, the first thing people are going to do is jump out and say what about Baldur's Gate 3? So I'll talk about Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 reminds me a lot of Cyberpunk, and that's not in a negative way, but Baldur's Gate 3 is like a horny game. Like it's very, depending on the characters that you involve yourself with and stuff like that. It's a very, charged up game. It's a very romance novel type of, look on sexuality and romances and things like that, where they're very spur of the moment. They're, I think like the Shadowheart romance you can do in that game has a pretty long progression and climaxes, for lack of a better term, pretty late in the game, and it's cool, and it's not like overly silly or anything, but it still just, if it still feels a little shallow, and none of the romances in any game have ever, in my opinion, felt like, oh, this feels big, this feels grand, this feels bigger than this game or whatever. They all are basically say the right thing or not, and either progress in that relationship for your character or not. And Baldur's Gate 3 is no different. Now, the way that the writing is in that game, and the way that the camp system works, where most of your relationships progress, and the way that various things happen, it's done really, really well. But I would still argue it doesn't seem like it's taken a huge step forward from Mass Effect romances and stuff like that. And then I'll talk about Starfield. Starfield's an interesting one because of all of the 4 games. It's the one that doesn't have any sex scenes. The other 3 do. And with, I would say, Baldur's Gate and Cyberpunk being as graphic as you can be about it, even though I will make a quick note, Cyberpunk's graphics have not aged as well as I thought they would. And when that scene happened, I remember being like, oh, this is a very interesting thing to see. But I also remember being like, man, this doesn't look great. But regardless, Starfield is interesting because I think maybe only second to Mass Effect, it really feels like maybe the one that is like the most fulfilling. Now, for full clarity, I've only romanced Sarah in Starfield. A lot of people hate that character for various reasons, and there's no sex scenes. It's still very much a Bethesda game, so all of your interactions are happening in these honestly kind of awkward face-to-face one-on-ones, and like, so it may not have the fidelity or the technical gravitas of Baldur's Gate or even Cyberpunk, but to me it's, if you romance one of the only 4 characters, which is another bummer in Starfield, there's only 4 potential partners, that you can take them everywhere. You can experience the entire story with whoever you pick. You can initiate a relationship, become engaged, and get married in Starfield. And it's maybe a little cheesy. It definitely feels a little rushed if you think about everything, but like, it was still interesting and it felt a little different. And one of the things I'll note about Starfield is that so like it happens in every especially Mass Effect, but Baldur's Gate as well, there's only so many lines, right? So once you speak to, you know, another character, even one that you're romantically interested in for your character, for the narrative, they will eventually run out of things to say and will just respond the same way every time. Where Starfield does something interesting where it does that, but they have like, it's like 5 to 10 different lines that the person can open with every time and end with. So every time you speak to them, you'll basically never hear them say the same thing twice. At least unless you're like speaking to them on purpose over and over and over again. And that was interesting. I also found Starfield really interesting in that, you know, without giving away spoilers, leading up to the end of the game, which leads to a choice, I think that's okay to say, your, at least in my case, the romantic interest has some like pretty in-depth things to say and feelings about it. And then depending on the choice you make, you can make a choice at the end where you return to your partner and they have some really unique, and everyone does in the whole game, but especially any romanceable partner has some really unique dialogue and some really interesting conversations that you can have. And what was interesting about it is that in so many ways, Cyberpunk and Baldur's Gate and even Mass Effect, you know, trump Starfield. And, you know, if you want to see romance scenes, if you want to have, you know, maybe some more unique interactions and stuff like that. But Starfield is interesting in that it does a bunch of things well that those games don't do well. And so it's so interesting that you would almost have to take like a hodgepodge of all 4 of the games and put together everything they did to make like a really exceptional, you know, narrative romance for your character in any of those games. And none of them do everything perfectly. I still think for me, I enjoy playing through the romances of Mass Effect the most. There's some epicness, there's some connectivity that feels nice about that. The Baldur's Gate, you know, romances are fun and even deep to a point. The Starfield one is, you know, kind of unsatisfying in a lot of ways, but then really, really satisfying in others. And then, you know, like with Cyberpunk, it's kind of the fun part of it, even though it feels like extremely unfulfilling. So I just I don't know if I have a big point here. I just kind of wanted to talk about it because you know, when I was checking out Cyberpunk, and I've recently played Starfield and Baldur's Gate and Mass Effect, I just kind of realized that I'm not finding myself being like, oh, this one has like trash like relationships and romances and the other ones are better. I think that there's something to be said for all of them, and I think the biggest surprise for me is Starfield, because it's missing so many of the elements that most people think of when they think of like what they consider a good video game romance, but it still does some stuff that the other games don't do, and that I hope maybe we see more of in the future. But that's just me. And that's what I have for this week, or this video. If you like the video, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button down below, leave a comment down below. What's your favorite romance, you know, situation you've ever experienced in the video game? You know, how do you see the romances in the games you play? Kind of let me know your take. I am curious. You can find me all over the internet as Bon Diesel, including over on Twitch, where I do try to stream a couple times a week. And you can come and say hello when I do that. And then I do have a weekly video game news podcast called the Bonfire Podcast. It's on all podcast platforms and right here on YouTube, so you can check those out. That's all I have for this one. So until next time.